Hello, good evening. My name is Jerome Page, and I've been working on what's called the 1960s Project. The 1960s Project originally started with voices from high school students in the 1960s, and the project has expanded to include people who were in school in the 60s, and then later, if you had a significant experience in the 1960s. So we're now calling it Voices from the 1960s. And what we'll be doing is recalling, remembering, reflecting on events that have influenced our lives. Before I introduce today's show, I have three asks for you. The first ask is to like and follow us on Facebook, on What's on Jerome's Mind. Also to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And then we also have a website where you can comment on blogs, so you can read and comment on the blogs. Like and follow our Facebook channel, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and read and comment on our blogs. In DC, the Chinese New Year will be held between February 12th and 13th, so just a couple weeks from now. And we're leaving 2020, and 2020 in the Chinese calendar is the year of the rat. The year of the rat, 1960 was also the year of the rat. 2021, this year, is the year of the ox. In 1961, that was also the year of the ox. We'll ask our guests about the significance of this. Our guest is Tom Fong, who is a third generation Washingtonian. He has ties to DC Chinatown going back over 100 years, and we'll find out when his family first arrived in Washington, DC in the late 1800s. Thing to note is the long-term traditions in his family. His paternal grandfather, whose name was Frank Fong, was a Chinatown leader when it was located on Pennsylvania Avenue before moving to the current location at 7th and 8th Street. This is something else we'll talk about, is that the Chinese community, like many communities in Washington, D.C., was constantly being displaced. And one of the major factors that caused the displacement of the Chinese community was the building of federal buildings. So they moved from, we'll talk about the movements there. Tom grew up in Adams Morgan, but yet he spent a lot of time in what we officially call Chinatown. Ted is our guest panelist, and Ted is the founder and director of the 1882 Foundation. The 1882 Foundation promotes public awareness of the history and continuing significance of the Chinese exclusion laws. Those laws prohibited Chinese from immigrating to the United States and barred them from citizenship. You can think about the Chinese exclusion laws as Jim Crow laws for Chinese people who were in the United States. Ted has also been very active in fighting racial discrimination and civil rights violation in the Chinese community. So welcome, Ted, and welcome, Tom. Hey, Tom.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah, and Ted, we're going to bring Ted up. Hey, Ted. Hello. So, Tom, Ted. No, I'm going to start with Tom. Tom, how old were you in the 1960s?
Well, I was born the year of the rat, 1960.
Okay.
So I grew up in the 60s. Didn't go to high school in the 60s, but I did attend elementary school all the way through 8th grade, Oyster Elementary, and then Gordon Junior High School in Georgetown.
Okay. So, all right. So You were obviously born in Washington D.C. When you said that your family has roots in D.C. for over 100 years, when did your family arrive in D.C. and decide to settle in D.C.?
So my two grandfathers, my maternal grandfather came to the U.S. in 1892. I don't believe he settled into Washington, D.C. until the 1920s. My paternal grandfather came directly from China to Washington, D.C. in 1904. And they were both restaurateurs. Um, my paternal grandfather, Frank Fong, was also involved in uh, the Chinatown politics and community and was the president of the On Leong Merchants Association and helped to run kind of the dealings of Chinatown as related to the city, the mayor's office, the police department, and was one of the leaders in the community. So,
Yeah, tell us something about growing up and what's your earliest memories of growing up in Adams Morgan and also your activities in Chinatown.
sure.
Well, let me ask this. Well, where was Chinatown located when you were growing up in the 1960s?
Chinatown was centrally located 7th and 8th Street, where it is now.
Okay.
But in the early 1930s, it had migrated from 4th and Pennsylvania Avenue, but through the government's right of eminent domain and their need to build federal buildings, they displaced a lot of they displaced all the Chinese residents from Chinatown, and they had to find a new home. And so they migrated to a central point, 7th and 8th Street.
Now, before, what was the effect of the building of the first convention center and the second convention center on Chinatown?
Well, again, through eminent domain, the convention center developers bought out buildings that were primarily owned by Chinatown residents for the large footprint that a convention center requires. The second convention center, which is currently in use, did a similar thing, but and I don't have all the specific statistics, but I think the purchase of the land and residential houses that are now the footprint of the new convention center was not primarily owned by Chinese Americans. It was a broader reach into the Black community, but both of those were big displacements of the population in and around Chinatown.
Well, maybe we can bring Ted in here because I know I've sat in on several sessions where he's talked about the effect of the convention center construction on Chinatown. Ted, can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that actually the huge displacement came about with the Galleria Place and the Verizon Center, now the Capital One Center. That was a huge displacement for Chinese people living in that area, and what came out of that was the development or trade some of that land or develop some of that land to some public housing, in which we call the Wallach House, which now has about 300 people and so forth. And then there was an effort, I think, to try to expand any further. Other people may know better than me, but it was not just the convention center and the Galleria Place. The metro was being built at that time, and there was an effort to try to take up the land around what is now Marriott, where Marriott is. And there was a protest that more people were being displaced around 9th Street,
right,
out of China,
in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and then around that time, that forced the movement of the convention center to where it is now, a little bit further north, and so that's the state of play.
Okay, yeah, I think when we talk about displacement in Washington D.C., the big story is around Southwest Washington, D.C., and the displacement of something like 20,000 African Americans and the dispersion of them and the destruction of businesses. There's not as much attention given to the displacement of the Chinese community, similar forces around urban renewal and the construction of federal buildings. So I just wanted to highlight that for our viewers and our listeners. So Tom, tell us something about what's your earliest memory in 1960 attending events in Chinatown?
So when I was growing up in the 1960s, I lived and went to school in Adams Morgan. And every day we'd go to my maternal grandfather's restaurant to work in the family-run business. But on the weekends, we go to DC Chinatown. On Saturdays, we go to Chinese Community Church for language school. I took Mandarin along with my sister, and my two younger brothers took Cantonese. And then after that, we'd always have a list of Chinese grocery items to pick up at. Usually we go to Miwa Long, which was one of the pillar businesses in Chinatown at the time. And we pick up Chinese foodstuffs that you couldn't get at the local Giant Food or Safeway, so that our grandparents could cook more Chinese dishes. And so we'd have two things to do: go to Chinese class and go to the Chinatown grocery and pick up Chinese foodstuffs on Saturdays. And then on Sundays, we go back to Chinatown for Lee Association Chinese class, where we'd learn other cultural things like writing with brushes, brushstroke, learn a little kung fu, and then pick up any other items that we might have forgotten the day before. That was our regular interaction with Chinatown growing up.
Where was your father's restaurant located? If it sounds like it wasn't located in Chinatown.
No, it was my grandfather's restaurant. Was in Adams Morgan. It was called Bing's Carryout.
Okay.
It was on 18th and Columbia Road, actually on 18th Street. And we did have interaction with a grocer who was a little bit ahead of his time. His name was Gong Lee, and he actually delivered Chinese foodstuffs in his green step van all across the DMV. And my grandfather's restaurant out in Adams Morgan was one of them. And so we'd see him once a week as well. But you know, the grandkids would always have a list just in case there was anything missing.
Okay.
But we were out in I guess it's the outer fringes back then, with Chinatown being down in the downtown core and Adams Morgan being, you know, albeit only maybe 20 blocks away. We were kind of north of Chinatown. Yeah.
What was the significance that some of your siblings, including you, studied Cantonese and others Mandarin?
I have never gotten to the bottom of that. But I'm glad I took Mandarin and learned it to the point that I did, because I got plenty of Cantonese and our village tongue, Toi San Hua, at the restaurant with my grandparents. So it actually expanded my number of dialects that I had, you know, a little bit of mastery of. But I'm not mastery of Mandarin, but you know, I was able to speak you know, basic Mandarin with adults, and you know, I cherish that opportunity.
Okay. Well, you mentioned the family village, or that's what I'm hearing. So where was the family village in China?
So on my mom's side, it was a place called Toi San,
okay,
which is where many of the Chinese immigrants came from between the 1850s and the 1950s. My paternal village was Hoi Ping, which is really just a neighboring town. But they were both in the Siep area of Canton.
And what were the major reasons for your family migrating to the United States and then to Washington, D.C.?
Well, my Gong, or my maternal grandfather, came with one of his older brothers. He was maybe 4 or 5 years old at the time. And in China, there just wasn't anything to eat. There were no opportunities. I mean, there was such a diaspora of people looking to, better their lives. And so he came for survival, and to build his life in a better land, and to feed himself.
Okay.
My paternal grandfather came when he was a young adult, and he came for similar reasons, but more for, I think, economic reasons. And so he also followed an older brother, but he came here looking to, seize upon financial opportunities.
Okay, it sounds like the tradition, common immigrant experience. That's something that we find in the Irish community.
Right, right. The one thing about the Chinese diaspora during that time, the 1800s, was that both of my grandfathers never really expected or planned on staying in the United States. They came here as a way to build their fortunes, but they always planned on going back to the homeland to settle, and to raise their families. And they always saw China and Toisan and Hoi Peng as their homeland. It's the world events with World War II and communism really changed the full plan that they had. And so, and also a lot of the rules and regulations in the United States, where, when they were, young, for many states in the United States of America, if you were Chinese, you couldn't buy land, you couldn't buy buildings, let alone vote. And so this was a temporary place in their minds. Mm-hmm. But with the change of world events, guess what? They made this country more of a permanent place that they had in their minds and their planning.
Let me bring Ted in here, because while the Chinese migrated to the United States in the late 1800s, there's also as the name of the foundation, the 1882 foundation, is to deal with the question of the Chinese exclusion law. So what were those laws, Ted, and how did they affect migration patterns in the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. The earliest migrations we're talking about is in the 1840s, even earlier, if you're thinking about some of the trade that we had with China, everything from sailing ships. And so we had people in Boston and so forth. But the large migrations would come into the United States in the 1840s or earlier because of gold rush, because of the railroad construction. And then a lot of those people then would migrate toward Washington. Also, in Washington, there's a special situation too. We actually had in this area a lot of people who came as scholars from the Chinese government, the empire at that time, or other private citizens over the period of time. They were exceptions to the exclusion of Chinese. So in 1882, after, of course, the railroad construction is done and all this other stuff is done, you started kicking out all these workers. Then we passed a law in 1882 that excluded Chinese from coming to the United States and prevented them from becoming American citizens. That law was passed regularly in 10 years intervals until it was made permanent in 1904. But as
Ted, let me stop you there just because you said we passed the law. Who's the we?
So the we being the U.S. Congress.
Okay.
So these are all laws passed legally, argued in Congress and then passed and signed by the president. These things prevented, and still there was, as Tom was saying, a lot of reasons to come, economic reasons. Wars were going on in China. You had rebellions in the area where Tom is talking about, the Toisan and the Kaiping area, which is just above Hong Kong and Guangzhou. That is a poor part of China, and so a lot of the economic distress fell upon a lot of these immigrants. A lot of these people who then immigrated, and the place that they immigrated toward was the United States for opportunities and other things. And the law stopped them from coming in, and people started trying to avoid them. And there were also exceptions to them, including students and merchants. So, and then also the other thing to remember is that a lot of the anti-Chinese feelings were mostly West Coast issues. And so a lot of people were trying to leave that area to go to other parts of the United States, which were a little bit saner as much as. So I think a lot of the migration that came into the DC area were people who were trying to escape from the more virulent type of racism in the West, or maybe going from New York to come down here for more opportunities. So it's an interesting mix of things there going on. And yeah. So what was?
Okay. Well, let me ask. Oh, go ahead, Tom.
Can I just interject one thing? I mean, yes, after the gold rush and after the railroads were, the Intercontinental Railroad was built. Not only were Chinese, the victims of racism. I mean, in many cities and towns, they were driven out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just, I don't like Chinese. It was, let's get rid of them, put them on boats and send them down a river. Who cares where they go? But they're not staying here, or they're killing them.
Yep. In fact, the formation of Chinatowns was actually the consequence of being driven out of rural areas. A large portion of it, of course, is because people will come in certain interpoles, and then they will get settled there, get equipped there, and then go out into the hinterland looking for work or to build families or other things. But the formation of the large Chinatowns like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and to some extent maybe Washington, is that's a protective enclave. So you have all these guys that were literally driving people out, burning houses and homes.
I refer to the Chinese Exclusion Acts as Jim Crowism for Chinese Chinese people of Chinese descent. Just so many of the experiences of denial of the right to vote, of forcing people not to be able to own land. There were towns in the African American experience called sundown towns. If you were black, you were not allowed to be in there after sundown.
Yep.
And we know about the constant destruction of black wealth over time, because every time a group of African Americans would make some economic progress, then white America would just come in and just burn them out, run them out. So
I would argue that the exclusion laws are actually worse than Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws at least were trying to prohibit you from voting, but you were there, and I would say the original Chinese exclusion laws was designed to expel the Chinese completely from the country.
I mean, eradication is really the word that I was thinking about. Just get rid of these Chinamen. That's really. But so could I just share one little story that growing up in my grandfather's restaurant, he would take me around as a 5-6-year-old kid and tell me how to fix things around the restaurant. But once in a while, he'd stop and tell me a little story about his youth and his past. Mm-hmm. And back before he cut off his queue, the long braided hair that Chinese men wore in deference to the emperor, because they were all planning to go back. He had his queue until he was maybe in his late teens. And he said, "Boy, let me tell you, Every day, the white devil would pull my cue. They yanked my cue, yanked my head back. And I looked up at my grandfather. I'm like, Gong, why did you just beat him up? And he looked at me like I was crazy. He said, boy, you never even looked at the white devil, let alone try to beat him up. I'm like, but why, Gong? He said, you ever did that? You had 10 white devils kicking and stomping you till you died, boy.
Wow.
And they roll you to the curb. And your dead body would lie there for days until your brothers or cousins or friends would have the gumption in the middle of the night, retrieve your body and bury you somewhere. And I'm telling you, hearing that kind of a story when you're 6, 7 years old, it shakes me now telling you about this.
I'm shaking listening to you tell it. So, okay.
So, I feel grateful that I knew my grandfather, but I feel he gave me a great pull back of the curtain. Here's what it was to live as a Chinese person in America in, say, 1900.
Right. We have one comment from Cynthia Page, and she says, I agree. The Chinese communities suffered greatly, if not more than the Black communities. So that's one of the comments we have. Tom, you mentioned about the restaurant and the food business. What other occupations were your family members in?
Both my grandfathers were restaurateurs their whole lives in America. My father and his brothers and sisters were all GSers. So they took the next step and they got college degrees and worked.
What's a GS?
Government civil servants.
Okay, so that's the working for the federal government.
They all worked for feds except my uncle Alan. He was an attorney, but my aunt, my uncle Frank, they worked for federal government. So did my dad, So I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Yeah, that was gives you a sense that so everybody wasn't in the restaurant business. I guess that's the point I was making.
Yeah, we were in the restaurant business as kids.
Right, but your father's brothers or your mother's siblings, were they had other occupations other than the restaurant business?
My mom worked in the restaurant. Her brother actually, the restaurant was named for him. He was my Uncle Bing. But shortly after we were born, he moved to New York and started his own restaurant. So he actually stayed in the restaurant business up in New York City.
Okay. And how many siblings do you have? I
have 3. I have an older sister and 2 younger brothers.
And what are their occupations? And what's yours?
Okay. I am a business guy, entrepreneur. Ran a hospitality technology company for 30 years. And doing other business interests.
Yeah, when I heard you talk, I've heard you talk a couple of times. You sound like a serial entrepreneur to me.
I do always have a few fingers in different pies. I'm actually doing a business now called eClean, which is using aqueous ozone to help kill COVID.
Okay.
I haven't even told Ted about this, but I'm helping my friend take it national.
Okay.
But we do a little real estate too. But to cover my other siblings, my sister is a electrical engineer, and she's actually retired now. My brother Bill is an immigration attorney in Houston, Texas.
Oh.
Yeah. And he's expanded his business from beyond just immigration attorney to corporate law. And I'm proud of him. He used to borrow money from me. Now he doesn't have to.
Is he paying you back?
We're all clear.
Your accounts have been settled.
And then my baby brother Bo is also an entrepreneur. He graduated from. We all graduated from the University of Maryland College Park,
Okay.
and my brother Bo got a MBA from the University of Michigan. My brother Bill went to a historically black college for his law degree, Texas Southern University.
All right.
And I got my master's at University of Maryland as well. So I guess we're all doing professional type work.
Well, let's talk about celebrations in the 1960s. Probably the big one being the Chinese parade.
Mm-hmm.
That
was definitely the big Super Bowl for Chinese Americans, if you want to call it that. We make sure that we're down there every Chinese New Year's to see the sights that you only see around Chinese New Year's. You know, the lions, the dragons, the firecrackers, the kung fu. You know, we saw our friends participating in the parades and doing the demonstrations of kung fu and other martial arts. I'm sure there was other things, you know.
Did you just go there as a participant? You stayed on the street?
As a kid, I went there as a participant.
Okay.
I'm sorry, as a spectator.
Spectator, right?
Yes. And then as an adult, I got into my Chinese youth club, and my kids were starting to learn lion dance, and they performed for many, many years in the parade. And then as I got older, I actually started to run the Chinese New Year's parade, which I did for about 7 or 8 years until last year. Step aside for the younger guys.
Okay. Wow. So I would just, I turned my head because I got another voice saying that we were frozen on Facebook. So I guess that'll clear itself up. So I was, as a result, you have to, Tom, I can't multitask, but here's a picture of you. Can you explain what this picture represents?
So that's right on H Street in Chinatown, probably just an hour or two before the parade kicks off. So, you know, we clear the streets for the parade route. And what I have on is a Year of the Pig hat, I think that is. We used to have parade sergeants, 15 or so of these parade sergeants that have these hats, and they're kind of ambassadors, but they help answer questions of spectators, and you know, just kind of adds to the celebratory event.
It seems like you sounds like you're really into it. There, it looks like you're really into it.
You know, I try to bring 110% of what I can to whatever I'm doing, and you know, the Chinese New Year's is definitely a big event for us.
Well, let me now. Here's a comment from Felicia Bowman. So, Ted, both of you need to listen up to this. So it's because it has some details in here, and it reads: Are you aware of Leo Bernstein? In his oral history, he describes how he helped the Chinese community relocate to where it was now. Previously, the area was a Jewish community.
You know, for my part, I'd like to hear more. I haven't. If there's another way to learn more about how that person helped us locate that to the current location, that part of the history, I'd like to learn more. So if there's that oral history somewhere, maybe you can send it to me, and that becomes part of, we're trying to document the whole history, how we moved there, how that place was selected, and so forth. And certainly that the current location is a German-speaking Jewish area, and a lot of business people there. There was a lot of warehouses there that the Chinese eventually bought in and took over. But it's still a place that is important both for Jewish DC Jewish history and our history. In fact, we are trying to do joint walking tours with the DC Jewish Historical Society. As some of the people in the historical society mentioned to me, they would do walking tours to show the different synagogues and the different places there within Chinatown. And within Chinatown, there are 5 working synagogues.
Mhm.
And some people always say, well, what is that Chinese building doing here in the middle of this Jewish area? But so what we'd like to do is do more of these joint recording of the histories and retelling the stories and so forth, because that's space. If you look at it sort of space and you look at it as sacred historical space, it's both for Chinese and the Jews who are there.
And you also have the African American community,
Yes,
because
and you also have
the synagogue at 6 and I was an African American church for what, 30, 40 years?
Right, and the current Chinese Community Church on the corner there was an African church, African American church, just before the current church, the current congregation moved there. They moved there from L Street, but it's interesting also that it was also a synagogue too at one point, and even at the high holidays when 6 and I synagogue, historic synagogue, and the high holidays when there overflow. The overflow of people attending those events, they would use the Chinese cemetery as part of the overflow location. So there's a lot of these sort of common sharing of spaces and the sharing of history that intersect that we ought to sort of like document and talk about.
Well, Felicia posted that she says you can find the oral history with Leo Bernstein by Googling his name, and the Jewish Historical Society sponsored his oral history. So, I can follow up with you with that, Ted.
That'd be great.
Talk about the intersection of communities, Ted. Let's go back to the 1960s. One of the major events of the 1960s was the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King and the unrest that followed that. How did you experience that, and how did Chinatown experience that?
It's the question for Tom. I wasn't.
Yeah, that's for Tom. I'm sorry.
So it's interesting you bring that up. I have a good friend, Penny Lee, who a few years ago finished a documentary, April 1968, Through the Eyes of Chinatown.
Okay.
And it really talked about the events around Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination and the upheaval, but it centered around, how was Chinatown impacted, and it did essentially show that, Chinatown was sort of how would you say it, Ted? Not ignored, but the riots didn't really impact the Chinatown area, in that a lot of the storefronts actually got word that, we feel like you're not, we want to protest or show anger towards. So we're gonna help you out, and you need to just put on the front of your windows. What was the sign, Ted?
So at that time, I wouldn't say there wasn't much. There was a lot of impact on Chinatown. Even, one of the large reasons for the movement of Chinese people out of the city, just like many other neighborhoods, was because of the street violence from there. So that had a huge impact, actually. But some of the physical violence didn't extend down south from U Street as much, because of there was an understanding that groups, especially Chinese grocery stores or other places that had a relationship with their clientele, which was African American or Black, and they would actually warn some of the Chinese residents, Chinese shop owners, says, look, you guys got to be careful. You got to close your shops, or you need to put like a an X. They would mark an X with chalk on the sidewalk or with soap on the windows, and that would be a sign that the rioters or the other street demonstrators would say, "Look, this shop is owned by Chinese. They are suffering as well from these racial issues, and so let's pass them over." So
what Lewis Hicks says that the sign was Soul Brother.
Yeah,
if you put Soul Brother,
exactly. They put Soul Brothers. If you know, Lewis, hi Lewis, how you doing? The Lewis with the DC Humanities Council and the 1882 Foundation supported the production of this film that Tom mentioned, Penny Lee. I would recommend everyone to see it. We produced that a few years ago already, but it's won a couple of awards in terms of its concision and its insights. And what that does is, the idea was to talk to people like Tom and other people and say, Tom, do you remember what it was like from a child's perspective, from your perspective when you were in the 1960s, young teenagers and so forth? What did you see? What did you remember? And Penny and Lisa Ma, two co-producers, did a superb job. And I would recommend that people see it. It's on the tube.
Okay, give us the name one more time.
It's called April 1968. Mm-hmm. April 1968, and it's part of a series called Through Chinatown Eyes.
Okay.
April 1968. I think the DC Library also has it in their collections. So if you don't have it, give me a message or give Jerome a message, and I'll send you off some kind of link.
Yeah, Tom, you wanted to say something else about this?
No, I think that summarizes what I was going to say. I mean, I wasn't in Chinatown during that 1968 riotous time. I was in Adams Morgan, but I did see a lot of the National Guard. My grandfather's restaurant was also spared. There were a lot of window fronts broken through, but my grandfather's restaurant really didn't see any damage.
Okay.
And I always wondered why. And I think it may have been, his relationship with his customer base, which was 95%, African American. That they probably wanted, for them to, after all the upheaval, still to be able to go to a Chinese restaurant and get some
Chinese restaurant and Ben's Chili Bowl. Make sure those he kept going regardless of what was going on.
Right.
So Tom, you went to school in Georgetown, elementary and junior high school in Georgetown. You lived in
elementary school at Oyster Elementary in Woodley Park.
Okay, so we went, which is not too far from Adams Morgan.
Yeah, just across
across the bridge. Across the bridge. And you went to school in Georgetown. You you lived in Adams Morgan. You would spend the weekends or at times at 7th and H, Chinatown. And growing up, did you go to bowling alleys? Did you go to skating rinks? Did you go to the movies? Where did you and your colleagues hang out?
Well, when we weren't doing chores at the restaurant, we were playing pickup ball, baseball, basketball, football at whatever fields we could find. We'd hang out and play pickup football at Calorama Park, actually near where former President Obama's family lives now. We'd ride our bikes throughout the city. We'd take our bikes down to Rock Creek Park with a fishing pole behind us and pull herring and shad out of the Rock Creek, if you can believe that. Carp.
Yeah, I was going to say that I don't remember that, but I didn't come to DC until '65.
Okay.
I know that the Humanities DC has also sponsored films on fishing in DC, and they've interviewed people who actually fished the Rock Creek and also the Potomac River. So.
Right. I mean, it was a different time. I don't know how much fishing is going on down in Rock Creek and the Potomac River and Tidal Basin, but that was definitely one of the memorable things. And growing up in DC is we just get on our bikes and get to some water and throw our fishing lines in.
Was there much in terms of racial interaction? Did you have white friends, black friends, Jewish friends, or you pretty much?
You know, it was amazing. I had friends of every color, creed, and creation, from Hispanics that, you know, the Anna's Morgan turned from all black to some black, mostly Hispanic, to some Hispanic, mostly white, to now, I mean, fully gentrified, and every skin color you can find. But I had friends that, you know, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, every kind. And, you know, I didn't think it was anything special back when I was little. But now I look back and I'm like, wow, that, you know, that helped make me and shape my thinking as an adult. And I cherish that I was able to have friends that I call, you know, my homeboys, that came from every corner of the earth.
We had a similar story on our very first 1960s project, because it was focused on Germantown High School, which I graduated from Germantown High School. And it was one of my classmates, Gordon Beseches, who I didn't know then, didn't meet him until a few years ago. And Germantown High School at the time was a school in transition. So he had friends who were white, black, Jewish, and he makes a similar statement. It was because of that created his career dealing in multicultural environments.
Yeah.
So,
yeah,
that was.
I mean, you know, despite that, we did get, growing up, the Ching Chong this and, you know, Ching Chong that, and that kind of bias. But, you know, I really attribute that to, you know, youthful kidding around and whatnot. You know, not the real mean spirited, you know, stuff that you're seeing, you know, now. But
and this is a different kind of meanness today. So yeah. Well, can you either you speak to the symbols or the animals and the Chinese New Year? The difference between the year of the rat and the year of the ox?
I got one little story about the rat and the ox. I know that.
Okay, so the rat is last year.
Last year.
Okay, and it was also 1960. You were born in the year of the rat.
I was.
Okay.
And so the Chinese zodiac goes in a 12-year cycle. So you know, you celebrate your birth year every 12 years.
Okay.
So I just celebrated my 60th birthday. So I was a year of the rat this past year again. But I guess way back in Chinese history, there was a big party and all the animals came together, and I guess the emperor decided that, you know, the first animal is going to be the first year, second animal is the second year. And the reason the rat came before the ox was the rat had somehow gotten the ox to give him a ride to the party.
Okay.
And before they got to the entrance, the rat hopped off the ox and walked into the gate before the ox did. So he was number one, ox number two. That's about all I can tell you between the ox and the rat.
Okay. Ted, you have any
Yeah, there's a lot of cute stories. We should learn more about them. But the one thing I'm trying to emphasize, I remember one year, a couple of years ago, Rita, one of the people at CCB, were arranging the parade, and it was the year of the snake. And I was saying, my goodness, how are you going to market this thing? Who has anything good to say about snakes? Yeah, at least rats. You could say they're mice like Mickey Mouse or something like that. But then, and Rita comes up with this thing, oh, they're just beautiful. They're slinky, and it's a woman's year. You know, we can, whatever. Anyway, never mind. But this year, the year of the ox, you know, the year of the rat, everybody is so happy. Last year's over. I don't care if you call it the Western year or whatever, the year of the rat is a great year to get rid of. Because I remember when we had the New Year's last year, I said, oh, I don't know about this rat year. It's kind of like rats in the bubonic plague or something like that. And then we had the COVID stuff, right? So this year, get rid of the rat, get it out of the way. But the year of the ox is going to be great. year ox, we're going to all go out and we're going to plow the ground together. We're going to make things grow. And so I'm very optimistic. 2021 and the year ox is going to step forth, and all of us are going to come together, plant and grow and build beautiful things. And when the Mid-Autumn Festival comes in October, we're going to have even a greater celebration. So look for that.
Okay. Well, here's a question for you, Tom. So you have you have a birthday every year, and then you have a birthday every 12 years. Do you celebrate the yearly one and the one that happens every 12 years differently? That's a question from Lewis Hicks.
I mean, personally, I haven't. It's just that, when it's your year, it's, oh, your year of the rat. You were born 24 years ago, 36 years ago, 48 years ago. It's your year. Every 12 years. I don't know if many people celebrate that. Ted, you can chime in. I don't.
I didn't realize I'm so much older than you, Tom. but 60 years. This is your 60th year this year?
Yeah,
2020.
So one thing about the Chinese zodiac or numerology is that 60 years is a cycle, is a complete cycle, a life cycle. So actually, after your celebration of this 60th year, you get a renewed life. You are on, this is like your year one, like this.
Born again.
Yeah, right. So you should say you're starting a new cycle, and everything is bonus for you. So it's going to be a great year for you, Tom.
Okay.
That's great. That's great. That's great. So Ted, tell me about the 1882 Foundation.
So the 1882 Foundation, as we said, takes its name from the Chinese Exclusion Act that was passed in 1882. And what we tried to do is promote education, awareness of the Chinese heritage, the political significance of the 1882 Act, how it was passed, and so forth. We do that with programming through three types of initiatives, which overlap, but they are basically preserving oral histories and historical sites. The second thing we do is we work with teachers and other people on curriculum development. We have some projects with the DC Public Library or with the Virginia Humanities Councils and some other things on education programming. And the third thing we do is we work with historical societies and museums to look at what is the best practices to tell the stories, how do we exhibit, and how do we want to do things. So in that, I like to point out that we also partners with the Chinese American Museum of Washington, D.C. That's a new museum that's just opened up, hasn't really even officially opened yet, but we are very excited that we're going to have this museum in Washington. It's right next to the National Geographic Museum. So there's a lot of things that we're doing, and one of the main things we do is we do have a slight national perspective. So we look at the Transcontinental Railroad and how to do heritage tours, but we do have a special interest in DC Chinatown because of where we are. And anything we can do to preserve the sense of Chinatown and get people engaged in it, both generationally and cross interracially, and that's what we want to do. And I hope all of y'all can join us into making this happen. One of the things about China, I would like to say one final thing. So many people talk about Chinatown, DC Chinatown being faked and being lost and so forth. They point out the disappearance of restaurants and things, but Chinatown is more than just the businesses that are there, or even the fact that if there are not so many residents there, it is a place that draws people. As Thomas says, Chinese New Year, people always come back. We're looking for some affirmation of culture and history, and that's what Chinatowns are about, and that's what other neighborhoods are about. So if we have like churches, Black historic churches and so forth, people still want to come and support those congregations and those events that are happening there. So don't look at just the fact that there aren't any restaurants there. In fact, there are. There are different things, but also look at how many activities and how many stories can be told and reinforced by the fact that we can come back and learn about them and celebrate them.
Yeah, we have a question from Dennis Houlihan. He wants to know, can you talk about the benevolent associations in Chinatown?
Oh,
There, when you walk around, you do see some buildings, and it says benevolent associations carved in the stone. Tom, did you?
Sure. Every Chinatown in outside of China, North America, wherever, has a Chinese benevolent association. And back in the day, they were used to help those immigrants who didn't speak the new language communicate with the greater population. But also, back in the day, they were even helping them communicate back to China, to their villages, and write letters if they uh, didn't know how to write Chinese language. They would write letters and send back money. But the CCBA is more the sort of community organization that pulls the Chinatowns together, pulls the people together. And in the CCBA in DC, it's actually an umbrella group over about 60 organizations, from family organizations to Chinese churches, Chinese opera, Chinese Restaurant Association, Chinese Youth Club, and others. But the CCBAs are very important in the Chinese communities throughout the United States.
so I just want to augment a little bit. Hi Dennis, how are you doing? Is that the associations, as immigrants come or people arrive here and they settle, they have associations by family, by village, by in the case of the Merchants Association, it's sort of like people banding together to provide service, provide help and assistance for them. And sometimes, as we said, the history of it is protection, just plain protection, or having people how to get the skills they need to be in America or live in America, save money, and so forth. One of the most important things they do, for example, is banking. The Lee Family Association has been around for a couple of hundred years in Washington, that period. But one of the key things they provided was banking and loans and so forth, which Chinese were prohibited from getting at one time, insurance and things of this sort. So they're very, very important associations for real practical purposes. But there are 32, I think, separate organizations in the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association. That, as Tom says, is an umbrella group for all these associations. One thing to again point out, that Chinatown is not dying because that association is still so very active. They do so many things, which are not only the most visible thing we see is annually organize the Chinatown New Year Parade, but they also do those other things that we're talking about. They run a very active medical clinic and other things which they provide for residents. The Youth Association is absolutely fantastic. That's the China Youth Corps. They've had volleyball contests for 60 odd years or 70 odd years. Tom knows that. And they rotated among different Chinatowns. The last time it was done in DC, the inter Chinatown competition. They took over all of Pennsylvania Avenue for a weekend. All right. How many? There were 250 teams from different parts of the United States, and they organized over 2,000 plus athletes to play volleyball, which was, as I said, the very first one. They're sort of inter-Chinatown competitions. So for people to say that and many of these still have associations still active in Chinatown, you don't see them because they're not places that the public will go in to try to get chow mein or something, but they are there. And to say that Chinatown simply has disappeared because we don't have a chop suey restaurant or even residents is not exactly right. There's a greater purpose for what Chinatowns do. And a lot of it is it's a cultural touchstone to reinforce people's identities and so forth, as much as a Black historic church might be. You don't want to.
Yeah, well, one of my cousins chimed in. Barbara says, "I'm enjoying this, cuz God bless you. God bless your work. I got a blessing from my cousin on this show, which is a good thing. Let me take a few minutes to two things to wrap up. I'll start with you, Ted, and then finish with Tom. Uh, you also run the talk stories.
Mm.
Talk about the talk stories.
Talk stories are our monthly community event. Once a month, at least once a month, we will have a speaker, and we will have a program to talk some aspect of the history or culture of China, of Chinese American experience. We just finished one last week on Chinese restaurant design and architecture. We had 200 plus attendees and so forth. We've had one tomorrow, Thursday, this 2 days from now. It's not exactly a talk story, but a similar format with the new Chinese American Museum. We're going to have a book review on a person who wrote a book on the immigration laws between 1924 and 65. And we'll have an immigration attorney also talk about immigration issues. That's on Thursday at 7 o'clock. That's part of our combined talk story programs. But the concept of talk story, I want to, anyway, just again, we've been doing this once a month for the last 10 years. Sometimes we have more than one event, but we will always have some kind of event. If we can't have a speaker of any kind of, author or something, I'm going to grab somebody like Jerome and say, Jerome, come here and let's talk about interracial relationships in DC. Or we'll have somebody talk about their genealogy searches. But the point of the talk stories is to develop strengthening community. So if Chinatown doesn't have if people don't have reason to go in China because the restaurants have moved to Rockville, or the stores, the big stores, grocery stores have gone into H Mart, Fairfax, and so places like that, there has to be other reasons to come in Chinatown on a regular basis. And we think that is to reinforce Chinese identity and community. And you do that by gathering people together in one place. It's always, and we tell stories. And the idea is to share our stories. By sharing and remembering these stories, then that strengthens the community. So we have a sort of slogan that says, it's our stories, our community, our strength. And if we do that, and we do it on a regular basis in Chinatown, Chinatown itself becomes a sacred space in a sense. And that keeps us and maintains Chinatown as an urban, as a distinct cultural destination within DC.
We have greetings from King Joseph in Los Angeles, California. Hello, King Joseph.
Hey, King.
Tom, so you were just notified that at age 60, you were on a news cycle, and you start your journey in the year 1960. So looking back, given your experience, how would you sum it up, or what lessons would you give in terms of how you were raised, and what would you pass on to your kids? Or another way to think about it, if you were writing a letter to your grandkids, what would you tell them? What would you want to leave them with?
No, that's a great question. And I gotta say, I am not as eloquent or elegant as my good friend Ted Gong. But what I would pass to my grandkids is, a couple things. One, never lose your pride in your heritage. Never lose that. Understand where your great grandparents came from, how they got here, and embrace that. Secondly, keep your mind open to other people, other cultures, other heritages, other things, to expand your worldliness, and give yourself that open path to whatever you're seeking. So remember your heritage, be proud of it, but be open to embrace others and seek to understand. And I think if we more of our people in America had that kind of a attitude, we would be able to have a better discourse and have a better nation ahead of us that's not embroiled in red, blue, Republican, Democrat, rich, poor, etc. That we would be able to better get along, and from that have a way to build a better country. And that's what I would tell my grandkids.
Well, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Ted. This is Jerome Page, and we've been listening to the version of Voices from the 1960s, and we have focused on Chinatown and what it was like to grow up in Chinatown in DC in the 1960s, and we've gotten great historical context, comments, so thank you very much. I invite you to look at this or share the post. It's going to be on the video. It'll be on YouTube shortly. And we look forward to seeing you on next Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for more Voices from the 1960s. Thank you and good night.
Thanks, Jerome. Thank you.
you.
Thanks, Ted.